Welcome to Series 9, Exploring Martin Luther King. It's Paul Medeiros coming to you today from New Bedford, near my residence. Let's introduce ourselves to Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King will be our third champion of the moral life. Martin Luther King will provide insights about the lives of minority persons. Martin Luther King shares themes, ideas, and philosophical terminology with Pope St. John. For example, in our readings, Martin Luther King refers to human rights and the natural dignity of any human person. He refers to the moral law, which is another term for the natural law. And Martin Luther King will use the virtues to talk about human goodness. Let's review Martin Luther King's biography. Then we'll review the learning objectives for our study. And finally, let's go over our documents for this week. First, the biography. Martin Luther King was born in 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. His father and his grandfather were pastors of the Baptist Church. In Our God is Able, one of the three sermons, Martin Luther King describes his close-knit and loving family. He says he received everything that he needed from his family. Martin Luther King was a precocious person. At 15 years of age, he had enrolled in college. And by 17, he was preaching in his father's church. As soon as Martin Luther King graduated from college, he went to graduate school. He went to a seminary first in Pennsylvania, where he became an outstanding student, and he went on to graduate school in Boston, at Boston University, where he studied theology. From his biography, we learn that 1954, 1955 were important years in Martin Luther King's life. He was married. His wife gave birth to their first child. He received or won his first job as a pastor in Alabama, and he also finished his PhD in theology. And one last but important item, his first civil rights activism began in December of 1955. Martin Luther King studied philosophy in Pennsylvania and in Boston. He studied Plato's Socrates in the Apology, and very likely in Boston he read Henry Thoreau, the essay Civil Disobedience, and plausibly he studied Walden. So philosophy is referred to throughout his sermons. Human life is referred to throughout Martin Luther King's sermons. There are numerous valuable life statements in Strength, Love in particular. Let's look at two life statements. The first one is on page 495. Martin Luther King writing, Jesus reminds us that the good life combines the toughness of the serpent and the tenderness of the dove. Martin Luther King is our first author to use the phrase good life. In the ancient world and in the medieval, we use the term happiness. Another valuable series of life statements are found on page 507. Martin Luther King writing, let us notice finally that God is able to give us interior resources to confront the trials and difficulties of life. Each of us faces circumstances in life which compel us to carry heavy burdens of sorrow. Adversity assails us with hurricane force. Glowing sunrises are transformed into darkest nights. our highest hopes are blasted, and our noblest dreams are shattered. Martin Luther King may be one of our most clear and insightful authors in Philosophy 225. His writing is both full of incredible metaphors and literary language, as well as unique insights. Let's review our learning objectives for Martin Luther King. First learning objective, to identify 5 virtues important to Martin Luther King. Second learning objective, to summarize Martin Luther King's proposals for good life, especially the proposal that opposing virtues in the person contribute to good life, and the proposal that any human life shows variation or change. Finally, the third objective, to learn Martin Luther King's solution to the compatibilism-antagonism debate. Okay, let's review our Philosophy 225 documents. There are 2 biographies in the Biographies reader that you may like to review. First is a 2-page biography summarizing the important events in the author's life. And there is also an intellectual biography exploring the author's intellectual influences, authors such as Henry Thoreau. Our 2 required readings, first, an interview between Martin Luther King and a scientist, Kenneth Clark. This interview more than likely took place in 1963, and somewhat like a philosophy dialogue, they explore Martin Luther King's main ideas, the idea of nonviolent direct action, and the idea Martin Luther King calls the love ethic. I want you to review that document to learn about those important ideas. Strength to Love is the second document. Strength to Love is a book published in 1963, and it shows sermons given in Atlanta, Georgia in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Some of the sermons were given multiple times in different locations, and we're only looking at 3 of over a dozen sermons. The first sermon is titled A Tough Mind and a Tender Heart, pages 491 to 497. Martin Luther King teaches us 2 virtues that make us versatile as persons and make life good. Second sermon is titled A Knock at Midnight, pages 497 to 504. The author introduces the idea of midnights in a human life and explores the 3 theological virtues. Toward the end, there's a valuable story about the Montgomery bus boycott that began in December of 1955. The third sermon, titled Our God is Able, pages 504 to 509, explores faith and hope. The author provides a second story about the Montgomery bus boycott that is worth looking over.